Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really digging into the profound economic shifts brought about by the second Trump administration's sweeping tariff policies.
Yeah, it's a massive topic.
It really is. And it's something that touches everything, from global trade to your investment portfolio, maybe even the price of stuff you see on your local shelves.
Absolutely.
So picture this. April 2, 2025. It was a day some were actually calling Liberation Day.
A loaded term.
Definitely loaded. And that was the day this unprecedented cascade of tariffs just swept across global trade. It sent these ripples, maybe even waves of panic through markets worldwide.
It wasn't just a tremor, was it? It felt more like a seismic event, really redefining international economic relations as we knew them.
Exactly.
And for this deep dive, we've got a really comprehensive Wikipedia entry as our main source. It's quite a factual treasure trove, actually. Gives us an incredibly detailed roadmap, the timeline, the country-specific impacts.
It's pretty exhaustive. So our mission today is clear. First, we want to fully understand all the facts, the mechanics of these tariffs, how they actually work, and the legal stuff underpinning them.
Right. That's foundational.
Yeah.
And second, especially for you, our listener, we're going to try and extract the most important nuggets of knowledge. What are the implications here?
What does it all mean for businesses, for investors, particularly thinking about the United States and Japan, but also, the bigger picture global trade, the global economy?
And then finally, we have to tackle the big questions. Is this whole turbulent period ultimately, is it good for the USA? That's a tough one.
Huge question.
And maybe more tangibly, what fascinating, maybe even surprising investment opportunities might actually pop up out of this, turbulent, tariff-heavy landscape.
So yeah, prepare for some serious aha moments, hopefully, because by the end of this deep dive, you should have a much clearer picture of how these policies are touching your wallet, your investments, and really every product you see. Let's get into it.
Okay, so to really get a handle on the shock waves of Liberation Day, we probably need to rewind a bit first. This wasn't exactly a bolt from the blue, was it?
No, not at all. This policy approach, it actually has a long history. It's surprisingly consistent, really.
Donald Trump's advocacy for tariffs, it goes way back. We're talking the 1980s.
Right.
And throughout his campaigns, he consistently framed them as this kind of multifaceted tool designed to achieve a whole range of goals.
Like what?
Well, preventing war. That was one justification. Reducing trade deficits, obviously a big one. Improving border security.
Yeah.
And even, maybe unexpectedly for some, subsidizing childcare.
Childcare.
Yeah. It's this really consistent thread woven right through his economic philosophy over decades.
Okay, so one of the biggest questions, and you hear this all the time with tariffs, who actually ends up paying for these things? The administration's line has always been, foreign countries foot the bill.
That's the claim.
But what does the data, like this Miller et al. Research from 2025 you mentioned, what does it actually tell us about that claim? Does it hold water?
Yeah, it's a critical point, and the data seems pretty, unequivocal on this. Miller and colleagues, they looked at Bureau of Labor Statistics data. This was between January and April 2025.
Okay.
And they found that Chinese exporters, even though they were facing this massive 30 percentage point hike in U.S. duties, they only lowered their pre-tariff prices by, get this, 0.7%.
Wow. Barely anything.
Exactly. Which tells us that, in reality, almost the entire burden was absorbed by American firms and, ultimately passed right on to American consumers.
So despite the rhetoric saying, foreign nations are paying, the actual financial hit landed squarely on American households and businesses.
Yeah, that's a significant disconnect, isn't it?
It certainly is. So you mentioned the burden falling on U.S. firms and consumers, and speaking of revenue, there was that even more radical idea floated.
Oh, the income tax replacement.
Yeah, that tariff revenues could eventually replace income taxes for people earning under $200,000 a year. I mean, that sounds incredibly tempting, almost like a magic bullet.
It does sound appealing on the surface.
But economists from the Tax Foundation, they immediately pushed back hard on this. What did they find?
They basically called it mathematically impossible. Their projections showed that even with these really high tariff rates we're talking about, the revenue generated would come out less than 25% of the cost of actually replacing those income taxes.
Less than a quarter.
Right. And crucially, that percentage would likely drop even further if import volumes fell because of the tariffs themselves, which you'd expect to happen.
Sure, that makes sense.
The administration did use the phrase some pain in acknowledging this, but they insisted, quote, it will all be worth the price that must be paid. What's fascinating there is the willingness to sort of acknowledge the pain while still pushing this long-term benefit narrative, even when expert consensus was pretty skeptical.
And this isn't just theory, right? We can look back at the first Trump administration for lessons. Those 2018 steel and aluminum tariffs, they led to pretty clear price increases for America.
They did, and they were ultimately ruled by the World Trade Organization, the WTO, to have violated global trade rules. So there was international pushback too.
And what about the China trade war during that first term?
Let's not forget that. A huge amount, like 60% of U.S.-China trade, ended up subject to 20% tariffs. And that conflict was, it was widely characterized as a failure for the United States.
That's a strong assessment.
Yeah. And then there are the tariff threats against Mexico in 2019, explicitly used to pressure them on immigration policy. And then sort of on-again, off-again 10% tariff on Canadian aluminum, even after the USMCA trade deal was signed.
So yeah, we're definitely not starting from a blank slate here. There's a clear pattern of behavior and a history of consequences to draw on, which makes the planning for the second term's tariff storm even more striking because it signaled an even greater escalation. During the campaign, the promises were for these really eye-watering rates.
Like what?
Well, a proposed 60% on China, a truly shocking 100% on Mexico, and then just a blanket 20% on all other countries.
100% on Mexico.
Yeah. And there were even specific threats against U.S. companies that outsource manufacturing, like a proposed 200% tariff on John Deere. This wasn't just, casual talk. It felt like a blueprint for a really dramatic overhaul of global trade.
And the economic warnings from the academic world were just as stark, weren't they?
They were. Critically, you had 23 Nobel Prize-winning economists. I mean, that's a powerful group signing a letter warning that these kinds of policies would, and I quote, lead to higher prices, larger deficits, and greater inequality.
Which is pretty much the exact opposite of the administration's stated goals of prosperity and reduced deficits, a direct contradiction.
So this raises a really important question. Who were the architects behind these policies, these ambitious, often controversial plans? Can you tell us about some of the key figures involved?
Sure. Peter Navarro is definitely a central figure here. He was appointed senior counselor for trade and manufacturing.
Right.
He's been a very vocal advocate for what he calls a permanent regime of trade barriers, arguing it's needed to balance the trade deficit. And he's quite outspoken in criticizing corporations for, as he sees it, prioritizing profits over American jobs.
And wasn't there some controversies surrounding him?
Yes. It's worth noting he had actually recently been imprisoned for defying congressional subpoenas related to the January 6th investigation. And during the first term, he often clashed with more traditional free market officials, like Gary Cohn, who famously resigned in protest over the 2018 tariffs.
Okay.
The Financial Times reported Navarro was expected to have significantly more influence this time around.
And then there's Stephen Mirren. He was the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors.
Right. Mirren released a white paper pretty soon after the 2024 election. It was called A User's Guide to Restructuring the Global Trading System.
Catchy title.
Yeah. And this paper proposed using tariffs quite strategically to deliberately drive down the value of the U.S. dollar. The idea was to negotiate something called a Mar-a-Lago Accord.
Interesting. Did that specific idea happen?
Well, the administration's final tariff formula didn't directly mirror Mirren's suggestions for that accord, but his underlying ideas that the dollar was overvalued, the tariffs could revitalize American manufacturing, they clearly shaped the administration's thinking.
So it gives us a glimpse into the theoretical underpinning.
Exactly. It shows this blend of, maybe established economic thought mixed with some highly unconventional approaches. It's a fascinating mix.
Okay, so let's shift to the actual implementation. The early actions of the second term seemed marked by these really rapid strikes and, frankly, a lot of confusion around the world.
Yeah, things move fast.
Right.
January 20th, 2025, the inauguration day, the new administration pledges this overhaul of our trade system.
And then just 12 days later,
February 1st. Several national emergencies get declared, including one on fentanyl trafficking. And this allowed them to invoke the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA.
Ah, the IEPA. That became the legal justification.
That became the legal lever, exactly, for immediate 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada and 10% on China.
So maybe explain that a bit more. How does invoking a national emergency under IEPA let them bypass the usual way trade policy is made? What does that tell us about their approach?
Well, it's a really powerful and swift legal maneuver, host. Normally, Trade policy involves a lot of deliberation, approval by Congress.
The usual checks and balances.
Right. But by declaring a national emergency under IEPA, the president can unilaterally impose economic sanctions, tariffs, things like that, without needing congressional approval first.
So it cuts out Congress.
Essentially, yes. It gives the executive branch immense power to act incredibly quickly, bypassing potential delays or, opposition from lawmakers. It really signals a willingness to use every available tool, even ones typically reserved for serious national security crises, to achieve trade goals rapidly and, unilaterally.
And things escalated quickly from that point. While the tariffs on USMCA-compliant Mexican and Canadian goods were pretty rapidly suspended, presumably to avoid immediate chaos in North American supply chains.
Right, that would have been instant disruption.
The fentanyl tariff on Chinese goods was quickly hiked up to 20% by March 4th.
And then just a bit earlier, February 13th, the administration announced plans for even more widespread tariffs. These reciprocal tariffs targeting all countries with trade barriers against the U.S.
Which must have set off alarm bells everywhere.
Oh, absolutely. It triggered this wave of frantic diplomatic outreach from capitals all around the world.
And what's really interesting here is just the sheer bewilderment, the confusion among foreign governments.
Totally. Diplomats were really struggling to understand the administration's strategy, or even if they were open to negotiation. Trump's own statements were kind of all over the place.
How so?
Well, sometimes suggesting tariffs would be lifted after talks, other times saying they'd be kept for revenue, or maybe just kept to discourage foreign goods altogether. It was hard to pin down.
I read Canada even alleged the tariffs were aimed at damaging its economy to pressure for annexation.
Yeah, that shows the level of anxiety. And a Japanese trade official really captured the mood perfectly. He said, and I'm quoting here, "No matter who I talk to in the U.S. administration, none of them knows what Trump is thinking. We don't even know what Trump wants to negotiate on."
Wow. You can almost hear the sheer frustration in that quote.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just foreign governments left confused. Remember when Vietnam offered to eliminate all tariffs on American goods? A pretty significant gesture.
Yeah, what happened there?
Peter Navarro, the senior counselor for trade and manufacturing, just flatly dismissed it. He said, quote, "This is not a negotiation. This is a national emergency based on a trade deficit that's gotten out of control."
So basically, we're not talking, we're acting.
Pretty much. It really underscores this unique, non-traditional approach to international trade diplomacy, or lack thereof, maybe.
And the immediate economic fallout was becoming visible.
Palpable, yeah.
Huh.
On March 12th, those 25% tariffs on imported steel and aluminum products were broadly imposed. And this quickly contributed to a negative U.S. GDP growth figure, minus 0.05% in the first quarter of 2025.
A contraction.
A clear signal the economic contraction had begun even before the biggest hammer dropped.
Which, of course, was Liberation Day.
Exactly.
April 2nd, Liberation Day, as they branded it. That's when the president declared a national emergency over the trade deficit itself. And that unleashed this universal 10% tariff across nearly all U.S. imports, effective just 3 days later, April 5th.
This wasn't just another tariff increase. This felt like the main event, the seismic shock everyone had been sort of bracing for.
And the markets reacted predictably.
Oh yeah, free fall. The announcement ignited a massive stock and bond market crash. Investors panicked globally.
And that immediate market reaction actually forced their hand a bit, didn't it?
It did. It prompted the administration to pause planned tariff increases that were set for April 9th on 56 major trading partners. They paused them for 90 days, pushing the deadline out to July 8th.
A clear reaction to the economic pain being felt almost instantly.
Definitely.
But even with that pause, the sheer scale of the conflict, especially with China, was immense during this period.
Oh, absolutely. The China-United States trade war hit its peak then. U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods skyrocketed to 145%.
145%.
And Chinese tariffs on U.S. goods hit 125%. It was just this unprecedented tit-for-tat escalation.
Thankfully, things cooled off slightly by the end of June.
Yes. A temporary trade agreement was reached. The U.S. reduced its tariffs down to 30%. China reduced theirs to 10%. And crucially, China agreed to resume critical rare earth exports.
That was a big sticking point.
Huge. Even the de minimis tariffs on those small Chinese packages were lowered to 54%.
But despite that temporary pause on some increases, the overall tariff level remained incredibly high.
That's right. The remaining tariffs still brought the average applied U.S. tariff rate to an estimated 27%, which, as you said, was described as the highest level in over a century.
Wow, and the domestic pressure must have been mounting intensely.
It was. U.S. retailers started warning the administration quite publicly about visible price increases and product shortages coming within just 2 weeks because of the China trade war disruptions.
And what about businesses?
A poll came out showing a massive 84% of business leaders were concerned about the impact on the U.S.'s global standing. You could feel the anxiety building.
And this pressure apparently led to a bit of a policy shift, or at least a change in focus.
Reportedly, yes. The administration seemed to pivot its focus more towards negotiation. Peter Navarro was reportedly sidelined somewhat.
Interesting.
And Scott Bessent was promoted apparently as the lead economic advisor.
And you could see the market react to this perceived shift, couldn't you?
Absolutely. The S&P 500 actually reached record highs by late June. The White House was downplaying the upcoming July 8th deadline.
And this led to that nickname.
The taco trade.
Yeah.
Yeah. Critics called it the taco trade, meaning Trump always chickens out.
Catchy.
It indicated that markets basically believed the administration had a pretty low tolerance for sustained economic pressure back home.
So what's the real insight there for our listeners? Is it just a clever phrase, or does it tell us something fundamental about how markets read this administration's economic moves?
No, it's more than just banter, host. The taco trade idea is actually a critical insight for investors, I think. It suggests that while the rhetoric can be incredibly aggressive, the actual willingness to endure significant domestic economic pain is perceived by the market as, well, pretty low.
So for investors?
For investors, it kind of creates a playbook, right? Anticipate the initial shock from the announcement, but then look for signs the administration might soften its stance when the economic pain becomes too visible, too politically difficult for American consumers and businesses.
It's a key pattern maybe for anticipating potential policy reversals and finding opportunities in that volatility.
Exactly. It's about reading the political tolerance for economic fallout.
Yet, despite these market concerns and that apparent shift towards negotiation, other tariffs kept climbing.
That's true. On June 4th, tariffs on steel and aluminum were actually doubled, up to 50%.
Doubled.
And then June 12th, they expanded those tariffs to include common household appliances, refrigerators, dishwashers, things people buy every day.
So it shows a continued, maybe more targeted commitment to protectionism, even while broader negotiations might have been starting.
Yeah, it wasn't a complete reversal by any means.
And just when you thought the economic challenges were enough, the legal challenges started heating up too.
Right. May 28th was a big day. A major blow came from the United States Court of International Trade.
What did they rule?
They delivered a unanimous ruling, stating pretty clearly that the president had overstepped his authority by using the IEEPA, that Emergency Powers Act.
Were the fentanyl tariffs and the reciprocal tariffs?
Exactly. This wasn't just some minor legal quibble. It was a fundamental challenge to the executive's power to implement these trade policies this way.
So what happened then? Did the tariffs stop?
Well, the Court of Appeals granted a temporary stay, which allowed the tariffs to remain in place for the time being. But oral arguments were set for July 31st. So this is a crucial legal fight still unfolding, one that could ultimately determine the long-term validity of using these executive powers for tariffs on this scale.
Okay, so moving into July 2025, the financial impacts were becoming clearer. You mentioned the revenue earlier.
Yeah, by July, tariffs had generated about $108 billion in net revenue over the previous 9 months. That represented 5% of total federal revenue.
Which is much higher than usual.
Much higher. Historically, tariffs are usually around 2% of federal revenue.
But the key question, again, is incidents who actually paid that $108 billion.
Right. And Goldman Sachs reported the burden fell about 49% on U.S. consumers, another 39% on U.S. businesses.
And only 12% on foreign exporters.
Exactly. So overwhelmingly, it was Americans paying.
So when we talk about incidents, what does that really mean for someone listening? It's not just about who physically writes the check to customs, is it?
Precisely. Incidence is crucial because it tells us who ultimately bears the economic cost. So while the initial narrative might have been foreigners will pay, this Goldman Sachs data shows it was overwhelmingly U.S. consumers and businesses footing the bill.
Which is why you'd likely see price increases on the shelf, not necessarily foreign suppliers cutting their prices. A direct hit to your wallet.
A direct hit, regardless of the political spin.
And that July period saw more changes, further delays, and rate adjustments.
Yeah, the country-specific reciprocal tariffs got delayed again, pushed from July 8th to August 1st, and new reciprocal rates were announced.
including for Mexico and Canada.
Right. 30% for Mexico, 35% for Canada, although, importantly, the USMCA exemption continued for most goods traded under that agreement. That's a key nuance.
And there was that surprising one for Brazil.
Yes, a 50% tariff slapped on Brazil, explicitly linked in reports to criticism of the trial against their former president, Jair Bolsonaro.
Which really highlights how these tariffs weren't just about trade balances, were they? They had these significant geopolitical and political dimensions woven in.
Absolutely. Trade policy is a tool for broader political goals.
Okay, let's take a deeper dive now into some of these specific tariff actions, starting with those big multinational tariffs. What exactly was being targeted?
Well, the steel and aluminum tariffs are a prime example. They started at 25%, then got raised to 50%.
And the stated goal was?
To strengthen domestic production.
Yeah.
But, the reality in 2023 was that the U.S. imported 44% of its aluminum and 26% of its steel.
Mostly from Canada.
Canada was the largest supplier for both. And while the U.S. used to be the world's biggest aluminum producer, by 2021, it was less than 2% of global supply, mostly because of high electricity costs here.
And they put in rules to stop companies finding loopholes.
Yeah, the tariffs included this mandate that imported steel had to be melted and poured in the U.S. and aluminum smelted and cast here, trying to prevent circumvention, ensure the whole supply chain was truly domestic.
And it wasn't just the raw materials, right? These tariffs expanded.
Oh, yeah. They expanded to include everyday goods, things like empty aluminum cans, canned beer, even major household appliances like refrigerators and dishwashers.
So for you, the consumer, this meant direct price impacts on a huge range of products you use daily, right down to the food and drinks in your fridge.
Exactly. Hits you right at the checkout.
What about copper? That was another significant one.
Copper is fascinating. A huge 50% tariff was announced for August 1st. This followed a probe into copper imports that started back in February 2025.
And companies saw it coming.
Seems like it. U.S. importers actually doubled their copper imports in the months leading up to it, trying to stock up before the tariffs hit.
Which must have affected global markets immediately.
It did. Shares of major mining companies like BHP and Anglo American took a hit. And think about Chile.
They're a huge copper producer.
Huge. Chile provides 60% of U.S. copper imports. And copper is a crucial 11.1% of Chile's total exports, though China is their main customer overall. But this was expected to significantly decrease income for Codelco, their state-owned mining giant.
Which is a major source of revenue for the Chilean government.
Exactly. Big impact there.
This raises a really interesting point, though, about U.S. domestic production capacity and maybe potential investment opportunities.
Definitely. The U.S. consumes about 1.6 million tons of refined copper each year, but only produces around 1.1 million tons.
And critically,
there were no known plans to significantly ramp up domestic copper production to offset these tariffs.
which directly implies what for prices?
It directly implies a hike in the final prices of anything containing copper components. That affects everything from electronics to construction materials. It hits manufacturers and ultimately consumers like you.
But for investors?
Precisely. For investors, this could signal potential investment opportunities. Think about U.S.-based copper mining companies. Freeport-McMoRan, Rio Tinto.
Why them specifically?
Well, with decreased competition from imports due to tariffs and potentially higher domestic prices because of reduced overall supply, these companies are kind of uniquely positioned to benefit from any push towards greater domestic reliance on copper.
Makes sense. But on the flip side, Chile faces some serious potential negative impacts.
Oh, absolutely. Decreased employment in their mining sector, less foreign investment coming in, reduced fiscal income for the government, which could mean a bigger fiscal deficit.
But you mentioned a surprising potential positive consequence.
Yeah, paradoxically, it might lead to a rise in global copper prices overall. If the U.S. buys less, maybe China, India, other Southeast Asian countries step in and buy that copper instead.
Potentially stabilizing international supply and demand.
Potentially, at least until new mines planned for around 2030 come online. It could cause a long-term shift in global copper flows.
Okay, let's shift gears to the automobile and auto part tariffs. Those were set at 25%.
Right. And this one hits particularly hard because of just how incredibly integrated the North American auto supply chain is.
Explain that a bit.
Well, for decades, factories have been shipping parts back and forth multiple times across the U.S., Canadian, and Mexican borders. It's this really complex dance of components. A single car part might cross a border 2 or 3 times before the car is finally assembled.
So tariffs disrupt that intricate flow.
Massively. And the big 3 U.S. automakers, Ford, GM, Stellantis, They lobbied hard against this, trying to get exemptions. They warned these tariffs would actually hurt American companies more than their foreign competitors.
And Ford's CEO had a particularly stark warning.
Yeah, Jim Farley said, quote, "Long-term, a 25% tariff across the Mexico and Canadian border will blow a hole in the U.S. industry that we have never seen." Pretty dramatic language.
And did economic models back up these concerns?
They did. Economist Arthur Laffer estimated car prices could jump by a substantial $4,711 per vehicle on average.
Ouch.
Now, the White House goal was framed as boosting domestic manufacturing and generating maybe $100 billion in tax revenue, noting that half of U.S. car purchases in 2024 were imports.
But what was the immediate industry reaction?
Painful. Stellantis, for example, temporarily closed factories in Canada and Mexico, and they laid off 900 American employees in response to the economic pressure. It really underscores the immediate, tangible human costs these policies can have.
Was there any relief provided?
There was some partial relief. U.S. automakers got a temporary exemption for USMCA-compliant auto parts made in Mexico or Canada. That helped smooth things a little.
But the ripple effects continued.
Oh, yeah. That trade deal negotiated with the UK, for instance, U.S. automakers actually criticized it because it ended up making it cheaper to buy certain British cars than one of their own cars assembled in Mexico or Canada using U.S. parts.
Talk about unintended consequences.
Exactly. It just shows how incredibly intricate these global supply chains are.
Yeah.
You pull one thread, and sometimes the whole garment can unravel in unexpected ways.
Now, another interesting policy shift was closing the de minimis exemption, initially just for China and Hong Kong. Can you remind us what that is?
Sure. The de minimis exemption basically lets low-value packages bypass standard customs procedures and duties. It's meant to reduce the administrative burden for customs on small shipments.
And the U.S. threshold had been increased significantly.
Massively. Congress quadrupled it from $200 to $800 back in 2016, and that led to this explosion over 1,000% increase in shipments, claiming the exemption by 2023.
Wow.
The U.S. threshold was way higher than most other countries, like 5 times the EU's level, and it was heavily used by Chinese e-commerce giants like Shein and AliExpress. There were also concerns some shipments were linked to drug trafficking, exploiting the lack of scrutiny.
So how did closing this loophole play out?
Well, it was a bit messy. It was initially closed for China, Mexico, and Canada, then quickly reopened because customs was apparently getting overwhelmed, then closed again, specifically for China and Hong Kong, on April 2nd.
And the duties were high.
Very high initially, 120% or a $200 flat fee for some items, although that was later cut down to 54% after those temporary trade talks with China. Nomura Holdings estimated this closure could slow Chinese export growth by about 1.3 percentage points and their GDP growth by maybe 0.2 points.
But here's where it gets really fascinating for investors, right? The adaptation.
Exactly. Chinese e-commerce companies like Temu and Shein, they adapted incredibly quickly. They started establishing physical presences, warehouses, distribution facilities inside the U.S.
To get around the import restrictions.
Precisely. This strategic shift not only helps them mitigate the tariff impact, but also, interestingly, boosts Chinese logistics management firms operating within the U.S.
So that represents a surprising investment opportunity.
It could. In domestic logistics, warehousing, commercial real estate, basically, companies that serve these adapting e-commerce giants. It shows how resilient and creative global businesses can be when faced with trade barriers.
And this isn't just a temporary fix for China.
No. Looking ahead, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which was signed on July 4th, 2025, is set to eliminate the de minimis exemption for all countries by July 1st, 2027.
So that signals a broader long-term policy change. It's going to force every company relying on low-value direct shipments to rethink their entire strategy.
Absolutely. A fundamental shift.
Okay, beyond the direct tariffs, the administration also introduced this sort of new threat landscape with additional proposals.
Right. They initiated an investigation into digital sales taxes, or DSTs, particularly targeting the EU.
These are taxes on things like online advertising and user data.
Exactly. And the context here is important. The U.S. had withdrawn from Pillar 2 of that OECD global tax deal. So this DST investigation highlights a broader disagreement on how to tax multinational tech giants internationally.
And then there were secondary tariffs. That sounds ominous.
It's a truly significant development.
Yeah.
This policy resembles secondary sanctions. Unlike primary tariffs targeting one country, secondary tariffs penalize third-party countries that trade with the targeted nations.
Give us an example.
Threats were made against countries buying Venezuelan oil or Russian oil. There was even U.S. Senate support for potentially 500% tariffs on major consumers like China and India if they bought Russian oil, and Iranian oil, too.
So it's a major expansion of trade as a geopolitical weapon?
Definitely. It's essentially trying to coerce other nations into aligning with U.S. foreign policy objectives by using economic pressure, threatening their own access to the U.S. market if they don't comply.
We also saw action on pharmaceuticals.
Yes, a Section 232 investigation was launched into pharma imports, and the administration later threatened very high rates, like 200%, on imported pharmaceuticals.
That's 100%.
Although they did offer a 1 to 1.5-year adjustment period, presumably to soften the immediate blow to drug availability and prices.
And let's not forget solar panels, films, and even toys.
Right. Tariffs of up to, get this, 3,521% were finalized on solar panels coming from Southeast Asia. This was directly targeting Chinese factories that had relocated there to avoid earlier tariffs.
Wow. 3,521%.
Then there was a proposed 100% tariff on foreign-made films. The justification was national security threat and propaganda, even while acknowledging it would cause U.S. job losses as film production had already moved overseas.
And that very specific threat against Mattel.
Ah, yes, the toy maker. 100% tariffs, or they couldn't sell in the U.S., basically because the company was diversifying its production away from just the United States. And the administration's memorable comment about not needing $30 for a beautiful baby girl really highlighted the granular, almost personal nature of some of these trade threats.
It showed a willingness to go after individual companies to send a broader message about bringing production home.
Exactly. Very targeted pressure.
Okay, let's dive into the reciprocal tariff policy itself now, starting with the core concept and, well, its potential flaws.
The basic idea sounded sophisticated. Research foreign trade barriers, then develop custom reciprocal tariffs based on things like existing tariffs, exchange rates, trade balances.
Like a tailored, precise economic weapon.
That was the pitch. But the simplified formula they actually ended up using was, well, highly controversial and much less sophisticated than it sounded.
How did it work?
It involved taking a nation's bilateral trade deficit with the U.S., dividing that by the value of its exports to the U.S., and then just cutting that result in half.
That sounds arbitrary.
Economic experts certainly thought so. They called it overly simplistic. The Economist had that vivid line calling it almost as random as taxing you on the number of vowels in your name.
Huh. That's quite a critique.
It highlights that the formula often seemed to bear little resemblance to actual trade barriers or economic realities on the ground.
And didn't it affect countries even if they didn't have a trade deficit with the U.S.?
That's the really striking part. Even countries with a trade surplus with the U.S., like Australia, still received a 10% tariff under this policy, which really underscores the disconnect between the stated goal of reciprocity and how it was practically applied. It led to tariffs that just seemed arbitrary and unfair to many affected nations.
And just for clarity, certain goods were specifically excluded from that 10% baseline reciprocal tariff.
Yes, several categories. Informational materials like books and films were generally excluded. Goods already facing high tariffs like steel, aluminum, autos, and parts weren't hit again by this baseline.
Okay.
Goods already under investigation, like copper or pharmaceuticals, were also excluded pending those specific probes. Most goods compliant with the USMCA trade deal with Canada and Mexico were exempted. And interestingly, smartphones and computers were later exempted too.
Maybe because they're so critical to the U.S. economy and just deeply embedded in global supply chains.
That seems likely. A pragmatic exemption, perhaps?
Okay, now let's zoom in on some of the specific trade conflicts and how different countries reacted to this tariff onslaught. Canada and Mexico are closest neighbors. Their relationship with the U.S. under this policy sounds like a real roller coaster.
It really was. The initial shock came with those immediate 25% tariffs, justified by citing immigration and fentanyl concerns.
And the reaction from Canada and Mexico?
Strong condemnation. Both countries immediately threatened retaliatory tariffs. Canada specifically targeted $20 billion worth of U.S. goods. The Wall Street Journal warned this could lead to a profound reshape of North American relations, highlighting just how serious the threat was to these deeply integrated economies.
But there was a quick compromise, wasn't there?
Yes, relatively quickly. Tariffs on USMCA-compliant goods were delayed. This allowed most exports between the three countries to remain tariff-free, preventing a total immediate meltdown of the North American supply chain.
But that wasn't the end of it.
Not at all. The subsequent imposition of those universal steel, aluminum, and auto tariffs still hit Canada particularly hard, leading to further Canadian retaliation on specific U.S. products.
And the friction went beyond just trade.
Yeah, the U.S. also threatened Mexico over its compliance with the Rio Grande water sharing quota, illustrating how trade policy was being intertwined with other diplomatic pressure points.
And it had political consequences within those countries.
It seems so. What's particularly striking is how these economic fears, fueled by the tariffs, reportedly contributed to increased support for incumbent governments. In Canada, Mark Carney's Liberal Party actually won re-election campaigning on an explicitly anti-Trump platform. Similar trends were seen in other nations globally.
And didn't Canada back down on something?
Yes, Canada dropped its planned digital services tax after a direct threat from Trump to end talks if they proceeded. It really highlights the immediate impact of these kinds of pressures.
And the July announcement of even higher base tariffs for Mexico, 30%, and Canada, 35%, just underscores the continued pressure and uncertainty.
Absolutely. It creates this persistent challenge for any business operating across those North American borders. Constant unpredictability.
Okay, moving across the Pacific to Asia, China, of course, has been this protracted battle.
Right. And remember, the first Trump term's Phase 1 trade deal had already famously failed to meet its purchase targets, which kind of set the stage for an even greater escalation in the second term.
How did it start this time?
It began with that 10% fentanyl tariff on Chinese imports, which was then quickly raised to 20%, a clear signal of intent right out of the gate.
And China retaliated.
They did, with tariffs on key U.S. exports like coal, LNG, oil, and agricultural machinery. But perhaps even more significantly, China started employing these powerful non-tariff barriers.
Like what?
Blacklisting certain U.S. companies, imposing export controls on critical metals like tungsten, revoking export licenses for key industries. They even pivoted to buying more Canadian oil, showing a strategic shift away from U.S. energy sources.
And what was the regional response to all this?
That's truly fascinating. On March 30th, 2025, leaders from China, South Korea, and Japan actually met, and they agreed to strengthen free trade among themselves as a direct response to the Trump tariffs. They even started exploring a potential trilateral free trade agreement.
So U.S. tariffs actually pushed them closer together economically.
It seems that way. It prompted this collective regional effort towards deeper integration, perhaps as a counterweight.
Then came the full force of the reciprocal tariff on China.
Yeah, that hit 34% initially, but the overall tariff burden quickly skyrocketed. U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods hit 145%, and Chinese retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods reached 125%.
And China hit back strategically.
Very strategically. They suspended negotiations over the sale of TikTok, and critically, they halted all exports of rare earth elements.
Which are essential for
So many high-tech goods, electric vehicles, smartphones, advanced defense technology. And China controls basically 100% of the refining process. This was a major strategic weapon, demonstrating China's ability to create significant supply chain choke points for the U.S.
But then the taco effect, that market anticipation of a softening, eventually played out with China too.
It did seem to. Trump appeared to soften his tone, especially after U.S. retailers started warning very publicly about impending shortages, and that rare earth cutoff created significant pressure on U.S. manufacturers.
So a deal was reached.
Yes. While China initially denied talks were happening, a temporary deal was reached in May. It drastically reduced the tariff rates for 90 days, U.S. tariffs down to 30%, China's down to 10%. And crucially, China resumed rare earth exports.
And looking ahead.
Bloomberg reported in July 2025 that Trump had apparently softened his overall hardline stance on China, aiming to secure a summit with Xi Jinping and work towards a broader, more comprehensive trade agreement, suggesting maybe a pragmatic shift where economic realities eventually started to outweigh those maximalist demands.
Okay, let's talk about India. They also found themselves under immense pressure.
Right. Trump famously called India a tariff king because their average tariff rate was around 12%. Compared to the U.S.'s much lower 2.2% at the time.
And India had ambitious trade goals with the U.S.
Very ambitious. They were aiming to double bilateral trade to $500 billion by 2030. These new tariffs obviously made that look extremely complicated.
What was the estimated impact?
Citi Research estimated India could lose around $7 billion annually from the tariffs. An internal Indian government analysis projected that a staggering 87% of their $66 billion in U.S. exports could be affected, particularly pharmaceuticals and automotive components.
So how did India respond? Retaliation?
No, their strategy was more diplomatic, cautious but active. They reduced their own tariffs on some culturally significant U.S. products like Harley-Davidson motorcycles and American whiskey. They increased imports of U.S. energy and defense equipment. and they offered to lower tariffs on about 55% of their imports from the U.S.
But they still faced a reciprocal tariff.
They did. A 27% reciprocal tariff was imposed. And despite those threats of potential 500% secondary tariffs if they keep trading with Russia, India continued negotiations. The U.S. Treasury Secretary even publicly called India one of the first trade deals we signed.
So it highlights India's strategic choice. Engage diplomatically rather than retaliate, even under significant pressure.
Exactly. It showed maybe a long-term commitment to the U.S. trade relationship, despite the short-term pain and uncertainty.
Israel also got hit.
Yes, a 17% import duty was imposed on Israeli goods. And interestingly, despite a visit from Prime Minister Netanyahu, Trump declined to remove it, even after Israel offered to remove all of its tariffs on U.S. goods.
So political alliances didn't guarantee an exemption.
Apparently not. It demonstrated that these trade policies seem to operate somewhat independently of traditional diplomatic relationships.
Okay, now let's really focus in on Japan, a major global economy, a key U.S. ally, and a country that truly felt the heat from these tariffs. This is particularly relevant for our listeners with an eye on Asian markets.
Absolutely. Japan was hit hard. They received a 25% tariff on cars and car parts, a huge sector for them, and a 24% reciprocal tariff on most other goods.
And the market reaction was severe.
Immediate and severe. Japan's Nikkei 225 stock market index plunged by 7.8% on April 7th. That was its third largest single-day loss ever.
Wow.
And remember, Japan is a heavily export-oriented economy. Its massive automotive sector depends on the U.S. for about 20% of its total exports. Analysts estimated these tariffs could knock 0.8% off Japan's overall GDP, a significant impact.
How did the Japanese government react?
Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba expressed deep disappointment publicly. He sought reconsideration from Trump directly by phone, but apparently negotiated no concessions.
They sent negotiators.
They sent a top team to Washington, but the U.S. refused Japan's request for a full exemption from both the universal 10% tariff and its specific 24% reciprocal tariff.
And the pressure continued.
It did. As recently as July 2nd, 2025, Trump even threatened to raise Japan's country-specific tariff further, up to 35%.
This constant uncertainty must be incredibly challenging for businesses and investors in Japan. How do you make long-term plans in that environment?
It's incredibly difficult. Japanese companies that rely heavily on exports to the U.S. face this deeply unpredictable market. It forces them to consider major, costly adjustments, maybe shifting supply chains, potentially even relocating production facilities back to Japan, or trying to focus much more heavily on other markets in Asia or Europe.
And the ripple effect on investment decisions?
Profound. Both foreign investment into Japan and domestic investment within Japan would be affected. It creates this really high-stakes environment for risk assessment. For anyone investing in or trading with Japan, understanding this political and economic volatility becomes just as crucial, maybe even more crucial than looking at traditional financial metrics.
Okay, what about Singapore, another key Asian economy?
Singapore also faced a 10% tariff, interestingly, despite actually running a trade surplus with the U.S.
How did they react?
Prime Minister Lawrence Wong called it a rejection of the global trading system. He predicted it would accelerate the fracturing of the global economy. Singapore chose not to retaliate, though. Instead, they formed a national task force to figure out how to navigate the situation.
So, potential risks, but maybe also opportunities.
Possibly. While a trade slowdown was definitely a risk, some analysts noted it could paradoxically make Singapore a more attractive alternative source for American buyers trying to avoid higher tariffs on goods from other countries.
But the uncertainty remained.
Oh, yes. Singapore's deputy prime minister warned that these tariffs might just stay in place until the very end of the administration, highlighting the potential long-term nature of this disruption for them.
South Korea, another major U.S. trading partner.
They faced a 25% reciprocal tariff. This led their government to announce emergency support measures for their crucial auto industry, which is heavily reliant on U.S. exports.
Did they retaliate?
No. Like India and Japan, South Korea pursued negotiation rather than retaliation. They engaged in what were called technical discussions with the U.S., but formal negotiations apparently failed to reach any breakthrough by late June, still in limbo.
And Taiwan, obviously critical for semiconductors.
Taiwan received a 32% reciprocal tariff, but significantly, semiconductors, their primary export and a globally critical component, were notably excluded from that tariff.
A strategic exemption, perhaps, given U.S. reliance?
Very likely. Taiwan called the tariffs that did apply unreasonable, but also chose not to retaliate. They offered to increase imports from the U.S. and remove their own tariffs. Domestically, this situation apparently exacerbated public concerns about the reliability of U.S. support, and economists predicted a potential 5% drop in manufacturing production value if the tariffs were ever fully re-implemented across the board.
Vietnam's experience sounds particularly dramatic.
It was. They were already subject to steel and aluminum tariffs, but then they got hit with a shocking 46% reciprocal tariff.
46.
Yeah. Their stock market crashed on the news. Vietnam actually offered to eliminate all tariffs on U.S. imports, but that offer was rejected.
And China got involved?
Interestingly, yes. Chinese leader Xi Jinping visited Hanoi during this period, reportedly urging Vietnam to resist what he called U.S. unilateral bullying.
Did Vietnam reach any kind of deal?
After intense negotiations and reportedly tough requests from the U.S., a sort of loose deal was reached. It stopped the 46% tariff from going into effect. In exchange, Vietnam agreed to open its market to more U.S. goods and, significantly, to reduce the flow of Chinese goods being transshipped through Vietnam to get to the U.S.
But it wasn't a solid agreement.
Apparently not. Vietnam's foreign ministry still described the deal as unclear and not final. They were reportedly worried they might still face even harsher rates than China in the future. It really shows the incredible pressure these smaller, rapidly growing trading partners were under.
Let's shift focus to Africa now. What was the impact there, especially considering programs like AGOA?
Right, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGA, is supposed to foster trade. But Nigeria, for example, despite benefiting from AGA, faced a 14% tariff because it had a $1.4 billion trade surplus with the U.S.
How did Nigeria respond?
They chose diplomacy over retaliation.
Yeah.
They started exploring options at the WTO and focused on boosting their non-oil exports and increasing trade within Africa. However, the impact was felt. U.S. exports to Nigeria plummeted by $527 million during this period. And while some Nigerian billionaires apparently saw benefits as their rivals faced higher tariffs, the central bank had to intervene, selling dollars to support the Nigerian currency, illustrating the broader economic strain.
What about South Africa? Also a major AGA beneficiary.
South Africa was hit first by the steel and aluminum tariffs, and then slapped with a 31% reciprocal tariff. This effectively nullified most of the benefits they received under AGA.
Did they negotiate?
Yes, South Africa chose to negotiate. There was a proposed deal where South Africa would buy liquefied natural gas, LNG, from the U.S. in exchange for getting duty-free quotas on exports like vehicles, steel, and aluminum to the U.S.
How was that received?
It was heavily criticized domestically in South Africa. Critics argued it benefited foreign corporations over national interests, and the potential economic fallout looked severe. Speculation suggested the agricultural sector could be hit hard, maybe 35,000 citrus jobs at risk, and potentially up to 100,000 jobs across various sectors could be lost. Shows the severe potential socioeconomic consequences.
Zimbabwe had an interesting response.
Yes, uniquely, Zimbabwe became the first country to announce it was scrapping all tariffs on U.S. goods after receiving an 18% reciprocal tariff. Their stated goal was explicitly to foster a more positive relationship with the U.S.
And there was a specific geopolitical move involving West Africa.
Right. In July 2025, several West African nations, Gabon, Guinea-Bissau, Liberia, Mauritania, Senegal, were explicitly excluded from upcoming tariffs after a meeting at the White House.
Why?
Reports suggested this signaled a strategic shift in U.S. trade policy, possibly an effort to counterbalance growing Chinese and EU influence in that region, using tariff exemptions as a tool for geopolitical leverage, rewarding potential partners.
Okay, let's cross over to Europe. The relationship with the European Union sounds like it was particularly contentious throughout this period.
Extremely contentious. Even before the inauguration, Trump was threatening tariffs on the EU unless it reduced its significant trade surplus with the U.S., specifically demanding they import more American cars, agricultural products, and oil and gas.
And the EU's response?
The EU pushed back, pointing out that while the U.S. had a good surplus with the EU actually had a substantial services surplus with the U.S. EU leaders threatened retaliation, but also proposed lowering car tariffs and increasing imports of U.S. LNG as a potential negotiating stance, trying to find common ground.
But then the U.S. steel and aluminum tariffs hit.
Right, and the EU responded swiftly. They announced a two-phase retaliatory plan, initially targeting $26 billion worth of U.S. goods, later reduced slightly to $21 billion.
And they targeted strategically.
Very strategically. They went after iconic U.S. products like bourbon whiskey and carefully selected targets located in U.S. red states to try and maximize political pressure on the administration.
And Trump threatened back.
He threatened 200% tariffs on EU alcohol in response. However, the EU ultimately dropped alcohol from its retaliation list after intense lobbying from key member states, particularly those with strong beverage industries. It was seen as a tactical retreat to avoid a much larger, damaging trade war over drinks.
Then came tariffs on cars.
Yes, a 25% tariff on all car imports was announced, which would have significantly affected Germany's powerhouse auto industry. This was followed by that 20% reciprocal tariff on practically all EU imports.
How did the EU counter?
They countered with a bold offer, a zero-for-zero tariff agreement. Basically, eliminate tariffs entirely on all industrial goods, automobiles, pharmaceuticals, machinery, the lot.
That sounds familiar.
It was strikingly similar to an offer the EU had made during Trump's first term, which he had halted at the time. Shows a consistent EU strategy focused on broad industrial tariff elimination.
But the conflict was delayed.
Yes, that 90-day pause came into effect. Trump delayed the EU tariffs, temporarily reducing the base reciprocal rate to 10%, and the EU, in turn, suspended its planned retaliation, created a temporary truce.
But the threats didn't stop.
No. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen warned of potential EU trade bazooka measures if negotiations ultimately failed. She specifically mentioned targeting the U.S.'s large services surplus and potentially hitting Chinese exports that were being rerouted through Europe to avoid U.S. tariffs. This showed the EU was preparing for a major escalation if needed.
And Trump kept up the pressure.
He did. He later proposed a straight 50% tariff on the EU, then delayed implementing anything until August 1st. By July 12th, it was confirmed that 30% tariffs on EU goods would begin on August 1st.
So in the meantime,
In the interim, the EU wasn't just waiting. They were actively meeting with Japanese and Chinese officials, seeking new economic deals and strengthening ties elsewhere. It really illustrates the global realignment spurred by these U.S. terrorist policies, a clear push for greater non-U.S. trade alliances.
what about Russia and Belarus? Were they included in the reciprocal tariffs?
Interestingly, no. They were explicitly not included in Trump's reciprocal tariff policy.
Why not?
The White House explanation was that existing sanctions, imposed previously due to the war in Ukraine and other issues, had already rendered trade between the two countries as zero. U.S. trade with Russia was apparently down to just a tenth of its 2021 level anyway.
But there were still threats involving Russia.
Yes, those secondary sanctions threats.
Huh.
Trump threatened tariffs ranging from 50% to 500% on imports from countries that continued buying Russian oil unless Russia agreed to a peace treaty with Ukraine, again demonstrating that direct use of trade policy as a foreign policy lever.
And the United Kingdom, post-Brexit, navigating its own trade path.
The UK, despite actually running a trade surplus with the U.S., was hit hard by those 25% auto and steel tariffs.
Did they retaliate?
Strategically, no. They chose not to retaliate specifically on the metals tariffs. They even considered reducing their own digital services tax, which impacts U.S. tech giants, apparently to avoid further friction with the administration.
But a deal was reached eventually.
A limited trade deal was reached in May. The U.S. eliminated tariffs on British airplane parts and metals, though within a quota system, and reduced the auto tariff from 25% down to 10% on up to 100,000 cars per year.
And what did the UK give?
The UK eliminated its tariffs on U.S. ethanol and agreed to increase imports of U.S. beef.
Was it seen as a big win?
Not really. Analysts generally call it a very small win for the UK. The 10% minimum reciprocal tariff remained largely in place. And remember, U.S. automakers criticized the deal because the reduced tariff on British cars actually made them potentially cheaper than their own cars assembled in Mexico or Canada using U.S. parts.
Yeah.
Highlighting those complex, often unintended competitive consequences again.
We also saw impacts across Oceania and Latin America, right?
Right.
Briefly touch on those.
Sure. Australia, despite facing what are called unjustified tariffs, chose not to retaliate. They introduced a 5-point domestic plan to mitigate the damage, but pointedly declined invitations to join hands with China against the U.S. Fiji, hit with a 32% reciprocal tariff despite having historically low import duties, announced it was actively seeking new export markets beyond the U.S.
El Salvador had a unique take.
Yeah, President Bukele surprisingly welcomed the 10% reciprocal tariff, calling it a great idea, which reflected a unique domestic political alignment, perhaps seeing it as strengthening his own nationalist stance.
And Brazil.
Brazil initially vowed reciprocity. They later adopted a trade reciprocity law but didn't actually implement broad retaliation. However, they were hit with that politically charged 50% tariff in July, linked to criticism of the trial against former President Bolsonaro, showing that direct link between tariffs and political disputes again. And there was even a brief trade war with Colombia, reportedly over disagreements about accepting deportee flights from the U.S.
And finally, any other notable mentions? BRICS, Eurasian Union.
Just briefly, Trump issued threats against the BRICS nations,
Mhm.
Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, warning them against any attempt to replace the U.S. dollar as the world's primary reserve currency, a clear defense of dollar dominance. The Eurasian Economic Union, for its part, assessed that it was not significantly affected by most of these tariff shifts, perhaps due to their lower direct trade reliance on the U.S. market compared to other regions.
Okay, so after that incredibly detailed tour around the world, let's zoom back out and really consider the broader economic and political impacts, focusing particularly on the United States. The sheer scale of this is just staggering.
It really is. This second Trump administration imposed at least 10% tariffs on an astonishing $2.3 trillion worth of U.S. goods imports. That's about 71% of all goods coming into the country.
And how does that compare to the first term?
It's a massive increase. The first term's tariffs covered around $380 billion. So this represents a truly widespread, fundamental re-engineering of America's trade relationships across the board.
And the core issue this created was?
Economic uncertainty, just massive uncertainty. The rapidly fluctuating tariff levels, the sudden announcements, the shifting justifications. It left businesses and economists in this constant state of flux, trying to figure out what was coming next.
Zanny Minton Beddoes from The Economist captured this well, didn't she?
She did. She posed that key question. Is this just a negotiation tactic, using tariffs aggressively to achieve specific trade concessions? Or is it something more fundamental, a push for kind of 19th century high tariff wall protectionism aimed at reindustrializing the U.S. economy?
And her point was, if it's the latter.
If it's the latter, she noted, the rest of the international system might just carry on, finding ways to trade around the U.S., potentially leaving the U.S. with a reduced global role, and maybe cut off from critical parts and materials it previously relied on.
And the data on U.S. economic growth and costs seemed pretty clear during this period.
Quite clear, yeah. U.S. GDP growth forecasts were repeatedly downgraded by major institutions, the Federal Reserve, the OECD. Ocean container bookings from China to the U.S. dropped by a staggering 64% when those tariffs peaked.
Which created real potential for shortages.
Exactly. Retail shortages, especially as businesses were trying to stock up for holidays and peak seasons. And most estimates suggested a significant cost to American households.
How much?
The range varied, but most estimates suggested an average loss per household somewhere between $1,243 and maybe as high as $4,900 per year, mainly due to the tariffs being passed on to consumers through higher prices.
And importers felt it directly.
Oh, absolutely. U.S. importers paid $19.3 billion in duties in just 1 month, April 2025. That's 3.5 times the peak monthly amount paid during the previous trade war. The Federal Reserve explicitly expected inflation, the PCE measure, to increase, with Chairman Jerome Powell directly noting tariff-driven price hikes as a contributing factor.
So this brings us back to that core question we posed at the start. After looking at all this, is it ultimately good for the USA?
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The administration argued, yes, tariffs promote domestic manufacturing, they protect national security, they could even substitute for income taxes eventually.
But the data points elsewhere.
The overwhelming data we've discussed points towards higher prices for consumers, potentially larger deficits if growth slows and tax revenues fall, and reduced overall GDP growth. And that taco trade dynamic we talked about.
Right, Trump always chickens out.
It suggests a pretty low political tolerance for the actual economic pain inflicted by these policies. It indicates that sustained pressure often seems to lead to policy reversals or softening, rather than a persistent long-term implementation of the highest rates. So while some specific domestic industries might have seen a temporary boost from reduced competition,
the broader economic picture suggests significant costs and disruptions outweighed those localized benefits.
that seems to be the consensus from most economic analyses of the period, yes, significant costs.
So for you, the investor, listening to all this, what are the potential investment opportunities that might emerge from this really turbulent environment? It sounds risky.
It's definitely a risky, highly nuanced landscape. The overarching uncertainty makes long-term bets difficult. However, You could consider sectors that might benefit from a sustained push, however inconsistent, towards domestic production.
Such as?
While we mentioned U.S. copper mining companies like Freeport-McMoRan,
Hmm.
domestic steel and aluminum producers could benefit if protection lasts. Maybe U.S.-based auto parts manufacturers if supply chains genuinely shift away significantly from Canada and Mexico, though that's a very long, complex, and expensive process for automakers to undertake.
And what about that adaptation by Chinese e-commerce?
Right, that's another interesting angle. The strategic adaptation of companies like Temu and Shein, investing heavily in U.S. warehouses to navigate that de minimis closure. That presents potential opportunities in domestic logistics, warehousing, and commercial real estate.
Because these companies, despite the tariffs, are still committed to the U.S. market.
Exactly. They're creating new demand for infrastructure and services within the U.S. to support their operations here. But again, investors need to be acutely aware of the volatility. Policies driven by executive action, especially under emergency powers, can change much more rapidly and unpredictably than those established through normal legislative processes. High risk, potentially high reward, maybe.
The political challenges surrounding all this were also pretty significant, weren't they, both at home and abroad?
Huge. Domestically, there were bipartisan attempts in Congress to try and limit the president's authority to impose tariffs unilaterally like this.
But they're blocked.
Repeatedly blocked by the Republican majority at the time. Senator J.D. Vance, for instance, cast a key tie-breaking vote in the Senate to uphold the national emergency declaration that underpinned those Liberation Day tariffs. It really highlighted these underlying constitutional tensions about the balance of power between Congress and the president on trade matters.
And the way policies were announced caused frustration.
Definitely. The fact that major policy announcements impacting billions of dollars in trade were often made via posts on Truth Social rather than through traditional government channels added to the sense of chaos and unpredictability. It led to calls for insider trading investigations from figures like Adam Schiff in Congress. Many commentators described it as fostering an unprecedented crisis of trust in the U.S. economy and government processes.
And looking abroad, China's adaptation is a key impact to consider.
Absolutely. As we discussed, while closing the de minimis exemption certainly hit their export and GDP growth in the short term, it didn't drive them out of the market. Instead, it forced these e-commerce giants to strategically adapt, increasing their physical presence and distribution networks inside the U.S.
Which, in turn, boosted Chinese logistics firms operating here.
Right. It showed incredible resilience and a redirection of investment, rather than just a simple retreat in the face of tariffs.
And finally, the impact on global trade alignments seems profound.
Profound and likely long-lasting. These tariffs triggered this global scramble. Countries everywhere started looking for new trade deals, trying to diversify their markets away from dependence on the U.S.
We saw examples like Singapore.
Singapore seeing both risks, but also maybe an opportunity as an alternative supplier. We saw major automotive companies like Audi, Jaguar, Land Rover suspending exports to the U.S. because the tariffs just made it too costly. Even consumer electronics, like Nintendo reportedly delaying Switch 2 pre-orders due to uncertainty. The ripple effects were widespread and immediate.
And it influenced politics elsewhere.
It seems so. In countries like Canada, Australia, Singapore, we saw how economic fear linked to U.S. trade policy arguably bolstered incumbent governments that promised stability, or were seen as better able to navigate the storm or find alternative trade paths.
African nations pivoted too.
Yes, hit hard by the effective nullification of AGOA benefits, many African nations began to prioritize intra-African trade much more seriously and actively sought new partnerships beyond the U.S., particularly with Europe and China.
And the EU's actions.
The EU actively pursuing new trade agreements with Japan and China is a direct consequence of this U.S. tariff policy. It highlights a significant fracturing and potentially a lasting repatterning of global economic alliances, moving towards a more multipolar trading system.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, reflecting on this whole journey through the incredibly turbulent world of tariffs, here's maybe a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to consider.
Yeah, okay. Lay it on us.
Are we witnessing what was just a temporary, albeit incredibly intense, period of trade disruption, something that will eventually revert back to a more predictable, maybe pre-2025 global system, perhaps once the immediate political pressures subside?
Or the alternative.
Or are these America First type policies, regardless of who implements them, permanently accelerating a fundamental fracturing of the global economy? Are they forcing nations irreversibly to forge new alliances, new supply chains, new trade routes?
Routes that could fundamentally alter the landscape for your future investments, your business's supply chains, and the consumer choices you have for decades to come.
It's a huge question with no easy answer right now, but it's definitely one that will shape the economic future for all of us, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. The long-term consequences are still unfolding.
Something to ponder as you look at your investment portfolio and maybe even your shopping cart next time you're out. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for listening.
We'll see you next time.